Okay, Blender tutorial. This is the CU Gamedev Club. I am Jess. What is Blender? It's a noun. It's also a 3D modeling and animation program. It is open source as well as free, which is very desirable for, people who are just starting out learning 3D modeling programs. You don't have to invest anything to, get started. And for small scale or even large scale game development, it's used to create 3D assets, which is really important. I got a nice little screenshot down here from the first game engine I've ever used called Leadworks, which is also free on Steam. It's kind of bare bones and good to start out with. So usually you just have brushes, which is what you can see on the left. But Blender is used to create what you see in the middle, which is the models or the assets that you can use. They're much more defined than brushes, and they have a much higher polygon count. And when you combine them, you get a really good looking scene like the one you can see on the right. Cool. So what can Blender even do? Here is Suzanne over here. This is the monkey they use to, display what Blender can do. It's kind of like their icon they use for everything. So if you're interested in creating video games, it's hard to avoid having to learn a 3D modeling program. If you're trying to do it alone, you're going to have to learn eventually how to create a lot of things yourself. If you're creating an entire video game yourself, that's a big task with things like music and models and level design and all that stuff you have to do. So it's really good to have a team. And most game engines give you access to only primitive shapes like brushes. And these primitives are boxes, cylinders, things like that. But when you create a video game, there's a need to create complex meshes to make it look good, which is what most people want. So to make things look good, you need to use complex meshes, and Blender creates them and can import them into literally almost anything. I've never found anything yet that Blender can't be used for. I think I found one, which was pure OpenGL, but I think we'll talk about that later. And Blender is good for texturing, UV unwrapping, excels in animation, rigging with powerful automatic features to auto rig things, numerous other features like 2D animation if you're into that, particle effects, which is really fancy and I don't know anything about, and rendering, which is really fun for creating art. If you're not interested in video games, it can be used for things like making animated films. It's used for 3D printing, VR, and more. And if you were crazy, you can use it as a game engine and make a game only in Blender, which is something fun that I've never tried. Examples of things made in Blender, just to give you some inspiration. You got trees, R2D2, the heavy from Team Fortress, and I made these two, which look pretty fun. Just a bunch of pipes everywhere, I guess. So if you're just starting out in Blender, I don't know how many people here have actually used it before, but here's where you can download it for free. YouTube is a perfect place. There's tutorials all over YouTube. And I recommend this one, which is very recent. And I don't know why, but it's kind of a thing to make a donut as your first project. And this tutorial talks to you about how to make this donut, which looks really good. And I guess now I will do a quick tutorial. I think I had one more slide for just, Blender has tons of hotkeys, which is really hard to remember. So I just added this here if you want to see those. As you can see, literally almost every single key on the keyboard is used for something. So if you mash it, you might end up with something really weird happening and not know how to undo it. So I would not recommend mashing the keyboard. Cool. I have a checklist here. So we're going to go into Blender. This is it. It's beautiful, isn't it? It's just a grid right now. Go on.
You're not sharing Blender. It's just the
PowerPoint. Sharing. How dare Zoom
you may
betray
need
me?
to stop the yeah.
What about now?
Zoom be down. There we go.
Perfect. So this is what's called the default cube. Every scene that you create will start like this. Ooh, chat. What's the catch for Blender?
It's hard as hell to use.
Yeah, that could be said. It takes a long time to get used to it, but honestly, once you get used to it and once you can memorize a lot of the keys they have, memorization is a big thing in Blender. Like I said, every single key on the keyboard does something. Once you have those memorized, you can do things really fast. So not much of a catch, but it has a learning curve. So this is the default cube. We're going to talk about the 3 main commands, which is extrude, scale, and grab. E, S, and G on the keyboard respectively. And I believe, I've never actually tried this before, but this is really cool. I believe you can show the keys you press. But I don't really know how to do that, so I'm not going to worry about that right now.
It might be in the user preferences. That's where it was years ago, but don't worry about it.
Yeah, I don't want to make you all sit through me scrolling through the menus frantically. So we have the default cube. So G is for grab, and that's to translate your cube anywhere you want on the map. S is for scale. You can make things bigger or smaller. And E is for extrude, which you can't do in this mode. We'll do that later. So whenever you do any of these operations, you can do it along one of the axes. You can see X is red, Y is green, Z is blue, but you can't see it right now. So if you click grab and then X, you can translate it on the X axis, Y axis, Z axis, and you can do it by specific amount by just typing like GX2. We'll grab it 2 units on the X axis. And of course, Control Z is your best friend in these situations. You can always undo what you do. But this is just an object. This is a brush, just like we have in any game engine. You know, it's simplistic. What we want is complex meshes. And to do that, you can go into edit mode. And this is where all the stuff happens. So you can see that each object is made up of a bunch of these points called vertices, a bunch of lines called edges, and a bunch of faces called faces. And you can select all these with the mouse, like I'm doing right now, and you can grab, scale, and extrude these just like you could in the object. So you can grab it like that, or like that. And this is where extrude comes in. You can't extrude in here. If I press E, nothing happens. But here, this will actually create new faces for you. And you can make things like that. So that's extruding and scaling and also grabbing. Next, we're going to talk about smoothing. So you can watch a lot of tutorials on YouTube about the basic navigation of Blender. I probably should have said you can just orbit with the middle mouse button. You can pan, a shift plus middle mouse button. A lot of things you have to memorize just to navigate this scene, which is a little annoying. But if you want to, you can use these cool new things on the side they added. These add tablet manipulation. So if you have a tablet, you can use Blender now, which is cool for things like if you have a stylus, you can paint and stuff, which is very useful. So we're going to talk about something that I didn't know about for a very long time when I started using Blender, and I kind of suffered a lot because of this, which is if you want to create something more organic looking, so you can go over here to the add button over here, mesh, and then we're going to go with the cylinder, and it'll add things for this little red and white striped circle is, which you can move really anywhere, but we don't want to. We want everything to be at the origin for now. You'll notice our cylinder doesn't look very good. It looks very liney and weird, not like you want a cylinder to look. And for a while, all of my models looked like this, and I wish someone told me about this a long time how to get rid of this, which is you can come up here and go to Object, and then Shade Smooth. But then you'll notice the edges look good, but the rim does not anymore. Something really messed up happened. And to fix that, we have to come over here to this little box on the right. So if you've never used Blender before, this box is home to really everything that you can use to edit these objects. This is the scene. It has all the objects in your 3D viewport. You can use this. If you have a lot of objects, you can use it to select the ones you want with ease. This one is used to change these objects. So this is our like position and rotation and kind of minor stuff like that. But we're going to go to the second tab over called Modifiers. And modifiers are really powerful ways to kind of edit the entire mesh at once. So I guess the easiest way to do this would be to kind of go through them all and show you kind of what modifiers do to meshes. So they're kind of like functions in programs. They're all self-contained and each do a special thing to your mesh. Like if you do an array, it'll kind of duplicate it as many times as you want. And they're powerful because you can edit them at any time, unless you click apply, which you should not do because you cannot edit them after that. So you can create an array of things. Wireframe is really fun. It'll turn whatever you make into a wireframe. And you can make things like that. But the mesh that we're going to, or the modifier that we're going to concern ourselves with is Subdivision Surface, which is probably the most used modifier of all time. And what this does is it'll subdivide every single face into 4 faces and then average them so they're smoothed. And as you can see, it turned our cylinder into this weird pumpkin looking thing. Kind of cool. And not what we want if we want a cylinder. But it makes the faces, makes the edges look a lot better. So we can turn this off in the viewport by clicking this thing over here. These show where you can see the modifier. So this means you can see it in edit mode, like when you hit tab. You can make it so it applies and not applies. And this is an object mode, so you can turn it off there. So we're going to turn it off for now. I'm going to add another modifier, which is, I believe it's called edge split. So this is another function-like thing that'll take your mesh or whatever you have over here and split it into 2 objects, kind of implicitly. You won't be able to select them differently, but there'll be 2 objects for all intents and purposes. And when you have 2 objects, things like sharp edges you have will become a lot more defined because there won't be any averaging of the two faces that you want. And since there's no averaging of the 2 faces, since they're 2 separate objects, you'll get a point, which will be really nice if we want a cylinder. So we're going to add our edge split modifier, and you can see that now everything is pretty much perfect. And our subdivision surface modifier, these all apply from the top down. So we want this to be below our edge split. And that'll make things look very good. And I covered a lot right there really quickly. I went straight from basic rotation to modifiers. So if anyone's lost, just let me know. And I'll make sure to, talk a little bit more about all this stuff. But let's see. Oh gosh, it's already 6:20. We gotta get to talking about other cool things. So I want to talk about smoothing. So, if everything looks all geometric and triangular, like this, and you want it to look smooth, you can literally just add subdivision surface, object shade smooth, and that'll make almost anything smooth instantly. So that's a good thing to know. So next we're going to talk about textures. You'll notice these are all kind of clay looking right now, which I guess is on purpose. And we want them to look kind of cool. And to do that, we're going to show real quick how to add textures. I think I had a nice little picture of something to show how textures work. Yeah, this thing. So textures kind of work like this, where you have them as a kind of flat image that you wrap around your object. And to do that, you'll notice that this texture was cut and has seams along the edge. And these seams are going to meet up to make a continuous texture like this little Santa chocolate has, which I hope you can see. And so to do something like that, we would need to go to edge and then mark seam. And that's not going to do much right now. Let's say that you mark a seam everywhere. So now everything's a seam. We're just gonna create a new window real quick. And this little button on the top right has all the different presets for what the viewport is editing. And we want to edit the UVs. So like imagine this is kind of flip-flopped, but like this would be on the right and this would be on the left to show these viewports. So if you go to UV here and click on wrap, you'll see that pretty much everything, every square has its own place on the map like that. And I thought there was a way to keep them linked. Yeah, this button right here. So now you can see each and every face has its own little place on the map. And if you draw on these places, those drawings will end up on this cube, which is kind of fun. And as an example of that, we are actually going to texture this real quick. So if you go to File and then Export, you always want to choose FBX, I think, for most applications. FBX is kind of the most universal file type you want to export things as. And I'm going to go with desktop. That sounds nice and easy. And then usually when you export things, you're not actually going to use Blender. You can, using its node editor tool that I never actually bothered to learn. But usually you use other applications to texture things like Photoshop or Paint, Microsoft Paint. I used that for a long time. But I recently got this really cool thing called Substance Painter, which we're going to use. And this is going to be really fast because Substance Painter is kind of scarily good. And Substance Painter is kind of out of scope of this tutorial, so I'm just going to try to go really fast through this.
But obligatory, how expensive is this software?
I don't want to talk about it. It's very expensive. I think Substance Painter is $100. So this is the same thing we saw before. It's just our default cube with its text right here. And this is the kind of justification for the price, is that it does everything for you. You can click this button. I think there's one thing we want to disable here, and it'll do everything for you. It'll make ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness maps, world space normal maps, and normal maps, all just like that. Which, if you don't know what those are, that'd be a good topic for a later game dev meeting. But all those maps are what make up a texture. And then we can go over here to Smart Materials and literally just click and drag whatever material we want onto this. And I'm thinking something like wooden cube looks good. Looks good, yes. So I won't spend too much time in Substance Painter. It's just automatically generating photo-based realistic maps for us to use in Blender. So you can do export textures. I think I had my own thing set up for cycles. And that's exported. Okay, going back to Blender, going away from the super scary Substance Painter. So we can see now that we have our cube. Each face has its own spot on the map, but we don't really know how to make the textures yet. So if you go to, I believe, here it is, Material, you click on New. This little material circle thing on the bottom is what changes the way it looks. And you have to click on new to create a brand new material we're going to use for this. And then we're not going to worry about it after that. We're going to go back to our editor up here and select, I believe, shader. And this is where another big thing that I really wanted to talk about comes in, which is Nodewrangler. It's devilishly evil because it's disabled by default. So if you go to preferences and then add-ons, you can search the node and find Nodewrangler here. And that's just something I wanted people to know existed, because Nodewrangler will automatically generate textures for you. So here you can see we have this really big, really complex thing. And if you're trying to make a game yourself, trying to mess around with all these settings and having to learn all this stuff is a hassle. But everywhere you can save time is good, and everything you don't have to learn is good. So you can literally just press Control-Shift-T, go to, I believe, desktop, and I chose temporary textures. And these are all the things that Substance Painter exported for us. It's just everything that begins with Untitled, because we did not actually name our project. And then you click Principal Texture Setup. And without having to learn any of this stuff, it'll actually generate all of your stuff for you. I didn't actually select this when I did this, which is funny, a little bit funny. And I'll actually do it all for you and set up this entire graph for you. I don't know what it does. You don't need to know what it does, but it just automatically works now by just enabling the Nodewrangler. So remember, Nodewrangler exists. It's very useful. And you don't have to learn how the how that weird graph editor works.
I'm going to throw in a caveat. The node editor is extremely powerful and you should learn how to use it.
That is true. I should not short sell it. But I also am scared by it and don't want to learn it. Especially when I can just hit those 3 keys and have something that looks like this in Blender. Oh yeah, these are your views, by the way. If you want to see your textures, you usually have to click on one of these. And as you can see, it looks pretty good. If we look back at our UV map that we made over here. Oh, you can't actually see it. Oh, I think you can. This is the this is just a weird version of it. Anyway, so if you want to make something really quickly, you can do that with Nodewrangler. And so we covered that pretty well, UV unwrapping. So remember, you can make things smooth. Don't make really pointy models when you don't need to. Remember UV unwrapping. If you ever need to texture something, just remember Nodewrangler exists. We talked about modifiers a little bit. There's a lot more to do with modifiers in Blender, but you don't use them that often, except for, you know, the Subdivision Surface one, which is the make everything look good modifier. And I guess now I'll talk about linked copies. And I think that's about the last thing to talk about. Oh, besides the render engine. So Blender has 2 different ways to render images, Eevee and Cycles. Eevee is really fast, but doesn't make as good renders as Cycles. Cycles is really slow and makes better renders. So I think I can switch it over to Cycles and you can see how much better it is and how much slower it is. And Workbench, I don't know. Never heard of it. But yeah, with Cycles, you can really tell that it looks good. That looks
So
really
for those who don't know the difference, Cycles is a path tracer. Eevee is also a path tracer, but it's more optimized for real-time applications. It bakes in a lot of the lighting maps and all this stuff so that you can actually render it much faster. So the difference really is Eevee tends to be baked. Cycles is a real-time path tracer.
Right. And Cycles, I think Eevee is used more for video games when you are doing things more real time, right? Does that make sense?
It depends. A lot of the times, Eevee can be used to actually accelerate a cycles render. So you bake in something like ambient occlusion or a complicated light map. Like if you have an emissive material, that is really, really hard for cycles to render. So you might bake it in with Eevee so that you can actually take those baked texture maps into cycles, and then cycles doesn't have to worry about rendering those light paths.
Yeah, that is a very good explanation. So we're going to switch back to Eevee so you don't have to see it buffering. So next I want to talk about this cool thing called linked copies. So if you're planning on making something really big with a lot of objects, and you might be disappointed if you try to do that when you go to render and Blender crashes and you get a sad face. And to keep Blender from crashing when you have a lot of objects, you can save on space and time by going to Object and Duplicate will create a new object. And you can edit it and do things like normal. It'll just be a copy of the object you have right there. But if you have tons of objects that are going to be the exact same, you can save on a lot of space by saying duplicate linked. And duplicate linked will create a new object, but it's not exactly a copy. It's, if you know programming, it's not a deep copy. It's more of a shallow copy, meaning that if you edit one, it'll edit the other. They actually share the same mesh and they have the same mesh information. So this one won't have any mesh information of itself. It'll just reuse this one, saving a lot of space. And you can tell it's a copy if you go to the object data properties. There's a little 2 here saying that there's 2 users of this mesh. And that helps a lot when you have tons of objects, and it'll keep it from crashing. It'll basically let you add a little bit more. It'll optimize your space. So just remember linked copies exist too. I'm just trying to cover things that exist to let people know kind of what they have to work with. And if they are interested in it, they can look into it more. Because Blender is really a thing you have to learn by doing. You can't really learn by watching many tutorials. You don't get the, it's a lot about muscle memory, to be honest. It's almost like a game. So what else have we to talk about? We talked about render engines. We talked about linked copies. Oh yeah, I guess we're pretty much done. It's been about 30 minutes. That's a good time for a meet. So I'm just gonna go talk about some cool inspirational things. Are there any questions so far?
Do you think you could paste the link to that tutorial that you mentioned in the beginning?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to paste that real quick. Chat's in the way. There's chat.
I've never done this with an actual PowerPoint, but if you could post your slides in the Discord, in like the, what's it called? The meeting videos and slides thing, if that's possible, then we'd have access to the slides the whole time.
Right. I just noticed my camera's doing that thing where it focuses all the time.
Ah, lovely.
Anyway, yeah, I'll remember to do that. Okay, is there anything in CS you don't learn by doing? Nope. And okay, cool. So this is a cool ornament I made just for, I think it was a winter competition to see who can make ornaments or something. And it's not very good as bare bones, but the thing about it is it has procedural lights. These lights around it was actually path, and the lights are made procedurally. And to kind of show how that works, we're going to hide the ornament because the ornament looks kind of bad. We're going to instead select this curve. So if you can see just so you can see the curve, this is what the kind of light stream actually looks like. It's just literally a line that has a really cool light stream following it. And just to show you how cool procedural themes are, you can actually make more of it just like that. So remember, you can use procedural themes like this if you're anticipating you're going to have to make quite a bit of copies of something like lights. And how this works is it's just a Bezier curve, Bezier curve? I don't know how to pronounce that. And you go to geometry, I think, and you can you can assign a mesh to it. I think the original mesh is hidden somewhere around here, and it's taking object data from that and just copying and pasting it over and over again. And if I unhide everything, I think you can actually see the original up here. Yeah, here's the original. It's taking this and just copying and pasting it along the length of the curve, which is pretty fun. Probably zoom makes it look bad, but it's pretty fun. And let's see, where's that thing I always show because it's so cool? This thing. So remember when I talked about linked copies? This is where something like linked copies would really come into use, because as you can see, this thing has, I think, a couple thousand pipe segments in it. And usually this would just crash Blender when you try to render it. But because all of these pipes are sharing the same mesh, this will actually run pretty well, which is pretty unique for something so complex. And here, let me try to show you. If you go to Object or Select Linked, these are all the things that share the same object data, which is everything, which is saving a lot of memory. Usually this wouldn't even load, but look how fast we can move around. There's not even any craziness going on there. If you go into render mode, you can see it looks pretty good and it renders pretty fast. So the linked copies thing is really powerful. And yeah, I talked about that for about 8 minutes. That seems pretty good. Cool. Is there anything else you think we should discuss?
I'm a little disappointed you didn't talk about the baking features. So for example, you went into Substance Painter and you used its, I mean, Substance Painter is actually ridiculous, but it can bake in all these different light maps and all this stuff. Blender can do that too, actually. So it's actually, it's not necessarily part of Eevee, but it's been in Blender for years. But if you are in the main camera menu, at the very bottom, there's a bake section. And you have different bake types like ambient occlusion, subsurface scattering, emissive, normal, shadow, all these different features, which again, lets you save on your render times. So just wanted to throw that out there.
That's a really good thing to mention. Yeah, if you want some key takeaways from this 40 minutes of me throwing tons of information at people, I'd be just remember smoothing, remember linked copies, remember UV unwrapping, and Nodewrangler. And yeah, that'd be a good list of things to keep in mind whenever you're starting a project. And let's see, these, you can see there's cloth in here. You can do cloth in Blender too. Cloth is a thing Blender is pretty good at. And Substance Painter is a little bit too crazy. So yeah, I would definitely, like Joseph said, look into the node editor for materials and also baking and stuff in Blender. I've never baked in Blender, but that sounds like it'd be fun to try.
I
Baking
can
in
share
Blender.
my screen real quick, but I have a different version of Blender. It's much older
Oh, 2.7. Yeah, totally.
because the models I have, because I haven't done anything in Blender in a long time, are older.
It's nice to not have my screen shared. It's kind of stressful. Oh, looking good.
This is an old model. So for the record, I'm just going to be in CPU mode because my CPU is faster than my GPU now, apparently, which is ridiculous. But so this is just pure cycles. This has no lighting information on it at all. This is actually baked with the emissive. So that's why it's just black. There is no light. So what you want to do with this stuff is you UV unwrap this model, which I apparently already did a long time ago. And this is actually the UV editor at the bottom of the screen here. And so you UV unwrap this model, and you want to actually go and create a new image. So image, new image down here. This is probably different on a new version of Blender, but it's just a different interface. All the same process still applies. I don't know, 4K. That sounds like a good idea. What's the worst that could happen? And so this actually applies to a lot of other different aspects of Blender as well. Whenever you want to do texture painting in Blender, which you can also do, you UV unwrap your model and you create a new image like this, and you can actually then paint directly and do all your texturing directly in Blender. Blender is not the best tool for it, but you can do it. But for baking purposes, this is the process. And you're going to have some material set up as well, which you set to an image texture. And in this case, I'm just going to select the image I just made, which is just untitled in this case. And what we can now do is we can go into the camera render settings. Sorry, I'm going to click on, we'll just do a ambient occlusion. And now we can just bake this. So it's going to take a sec to bake because I chose a stupid texture resolution. But when this is finished baking, we'll be able to actually render this and actually get ambient occlusion out of our render without actually having to have ambient occlusion enabled. And if you don't know how to enable ambient occlusion, you actually do it in the world settings under ambient occlusion right here. But for now, I'm just going to leave that disabled. So there's a lot of other powerful things about materials in Blender as well. You can actually assign multiple materials to the same mesh and basically assign a material to different faces. So use this emissive, and I'll just select this portion right here, and I can actually assign this portion its own material. And so when we render this, only that portion of the object actually has a material on it. And this would be another case if you wanted to use baking to bake that lighting information into the render. So I accidentally canceled the render, but you can see here that we have most of it done, except for the parts that I screwed up. But so now we have ambient occlusion information baked into the texture map without having to have ambient occlusion enabled at all. So just to prove that that is actually what's going on here, I'm going to get rid of this image texture. So that's pink, because we all like pink. And I'll give this a new texture, which is just diffuse. And so that's just what it looks like with no ambient occlusion on it at all. And if we get ambient occlusion on here, we can change our factors and our distance, which is terrible, but you kind of get the idea what you can do with this. But yeah, so that's just kind of some nice things you can do inside of Blender without having to actually take it out at all. Once you get a hang of the node editor, you can actually do some really crazy things. You can actually create your own bump maps inside of Blender with noise. You can do all sorts of crazy, physically accurate node setups, like with Fresnel and glossy diffuse. You can do really fancy car paints once you get a hang of that. There's a really interesting post on blenderartist.org from years ago where somebody did some really amazing material work with crystals. I should try to find that and put that in the Discord. But Blender is a very powerful tool that is basically approached what any other paid for tool can do. And it has so many features in it to learn, so many different tools inside of it. It really takes years to master. So if you guys want to start using it for game dev, you got to start using it now. So you can start getting a hang of it. But anyways, that's just what I wanted to throw out there. So you get a slightly more in-depth look at some of the material stuff and some of the more advanced features.
That was a really good addition. Yeah. Definitely the sooner you start working with Blender, the better. The learning curve takes a while to get over, but it's totally worth it. And the stuff you can make are super, super detailed and advanced, and they just look good, which is what everyone wants.